Hello, and welcome to the Disney Attraction Experience. This is the first video in a series where I take common film terms and techniques and use them to analyze the experience of Disney theme park attractions. I strongly feel that going to a Disney theme park and riding an attraction is an artistic experience. And while a lot of people enjoy criticizing or reviewing rides, I don't think they necessarily look at it in that way. Walt Disney was in the film industry, and when he built Disneyland, he was clearly in the market to bring the experience of his films to the guests. Therefore, I feel that the process of analyzing attractions lends itself to be best analyzed like you would a film. I think that, similar to in film, sound is one of the many aspects that goes underappreciated. In this video, I want to discuss the use of diegetic sound in Disney rides, more specifically within the musical soundtrack. So what is diegetic sound? In film, diegetic sound is simply sound that has its source within the narrative world. The opposite of this would be non-diegetic sound, which does not belong within the narrative world. Here's a simple way to look at it. If the characters in the story can hear it, it's diegetic. If they can't, non-diegetic. There's also two more terms worth mentioning: synchronous sound, which has a source on screen, and asynchronous, which cannot be seen on screen. Your typical film will have a mixture of various elements: dialogue, ambient sound, source music, etc. Now, the difference between source music and the overall soundtrack is simple. Source music will take place within the world of the characters. For example, music playing in the car. The soundtrack, or score, is only heard by the audience to set the tone. I find Disney's use of soundtrack intriguing because while in film, the score is typically non-diegetic, in Disney rides this isn't always the case. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use two of my favorite attractions, Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. The Haunted Mansion utilizes a soundtrack that consists entirely of diegetic sound. There isn't one single instance of non-diegetic music being used. By the way, I'm using the Walt Disney World version as my example. Upon entering the foyer, the first music we hear is the main theme, Grinning Ghosts, played on a small chamber organ. Diegetic, but asynchronous. Let's pretend that everything the guests see is part of the on-screen verisimilitude, then there is no on-screen source in sight. Perhaps the performer is some kind of disembodied spirit. The loading area, or the limbo, uses a slow variation on the main theme, using a flute and chimes to impersonate wind. The next few scenes are accompanied by a solo piano, which we eventually see is being performed by a disembodied spirit. According to DoomBuggies.com, this is our ghost host. Regardless of who it is, this is synchronous. The hallway of knocking doors has more organ, asynchronous. The seance circle uses instruments that are floating around in the room, synchronous. Probably the most obvious example would be the ballroom scene. Here, the main theme is performed by a phantom organ player as the rest of the ghosts engage in their festivities. The attic has a slight change in pace, as it is, I believe, the only time Grinning Ghosts is not the base of the soundtrack. Instead, it's Here Comes the Bride, and it's asynchronous, but still diegetic. The graveyard is also obvious, as all of the ghosts are literally singing and playing their instruments. And as guests leave the attraction, they can hear a phantom quintet sing one final verse. It's all genius, and every scene is diegetic. The soundtrack can theoretically be heard by anybody within the mansion. But it's also brilliant because, unlike diegetic music in film, which is just pre-recorded source music, the soundtrack in this ride still serves a purpose of setting the mood for the story. Making the soundtrack exclusively diegetic also naturally immerses the audience in this fabricated world. And while this is important for any ride, I think it's vital for a haunted house attraction where the goal is to make the audience feel a little bit vulnerable. Haunted Mansion is a great example of the brilliance of an exclusively diegetic soundtrack, but more often than not, most attractions are seamlessly juggling both without the audience even realizing it. I really like the way they handle it in Pirates of the Caribbean, particularly the Disneyland version, because the Walt Disney World version just kinda sucks. The attraction begins in the Blue Bayou section. After we pass the brass band and ambience of the restaurant, the music solely emanates from an old man playing banjo, synchronous and diegetic. After the first drop, we briefly hear the main theme. However, there is clearly nobody around to perform it, just lots of cave, so this is non-diegetic. And when analyzing it, it may seem like a weird choice, but when writing it, it's actually very fitting. The music feeds off of the excitement of the first drop and acts as an overture for what's to come. Asynchronous, non-diegetic. next few scenes that accompany all those skeletons and stuff, they're all non-diegetic, and once we see Davy Jones, the organ gives it a more cinematic undertone. This is all asynchronous. Once we enter the town, the soundtrack becomes diegetic, relying solely on the flute player, still playing variations on the theme. And then finally, the musical finale we've all been expecting, sung by a town of pillaging scoundrels. And even the drunk pirates in the final shootout are singing the song, albeit in a very, very drunk fashion. And there are many aficionados and purists that would disagree with me, but I love the way the ride wraps itself up. As we journey back up the waterfall, the theme returns back in the style of a cinematic organ that, in my opinion, punctuates the whole experience very nicely. Unless you're in Disney World. Disney World just kind of abruptly stops right at the prison scene. It's just, there's no one, it sucks, I hate it. And obviously, these aren't the only 2 rides worth talking about. Spaceship Earth, Rock and Roller Coaster, Splash Mountain, Space Mountain, you name it. They all handle this in different ways. And this brings me back to my first point, which is that regardless of whether it's diegetic, non-diegetic, or some combination, it's all seamless. And that's exactly how a good attraction should be. This is all just the tip of the iceberg. I could talk about so much just regarding the sound of a ride alone, not to mention narrative, verisimilitude, cinematography, or whatever. So what else do you guys want to hear about? And I'm curious, what's your favorite Disney ride soundtrack? Past or present? Let me know, and if you like what you see, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. I'm going to try and put out a new video every week, and you can go check out my website. There's a link down in the description where I talk about all this stuff in more detail, and I have some links so you can listen to the isolated sounds for yourselves. Alright, that's all I got for you guys, but like I said, there's plenty more where this came from, so feel free to check back later. There'll be more Disney attraction experience coming very soon. See you next time.